Let me give it to you straight and simple, folks. UK fiscal policy is the operative room, but it feels like the central bank, led by the Bank of England, BOE, is working on surgery without anesthesia. Painful, prolonged, and a mess that could go wrong any minute. Chancellor Rachel Reeves just walked out of the parliamentary halls with a bold promise to expand government spending by £142 billion over 5 years. That sounds great for public sentiment, more investment, more services, and most importantly, more borrowing. What could possibly go wrong, right? But let me tell you one thing up front, while the government might think they're stroking the economy back into health, by raising debt alongside promises to boost public services, they're simultaneously raising the debt ceiling to stratospheric levels and intensifying the struggle to control spiraling inflation. In fact, the Bank of England, which had already struggled to calm inflation during the pandemic chaos, is now facing a much more convoluted conundrum. It's walking a tightrope, trying to cool down inflation but at the same time brought to its knees under the burden of hefty borrowing the government decided to embrace. So what's really happening here? Let's roll through the intricate dysfunction of this fiscal game on both sides, government spending and BOE's inflation control efforts. Strap in tight. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor who seems to have stepped out with an inflated checkbook and a vision of extensive government budget generosity, has essentially pledged to balloon borrowing by £142 billion, $184 billion. So whether it's public services or lifting laborers' wages through a sharp minimum wage hike, there's more cash splashing through the economy, but it's as if they forgot about inflation. Under ordinary circumstances, improving funding in public sectors is a sound plan. Investing in infrastructure and services is absolutely necessary when it comes to expanding economic capacity. Take a look at China's infrastructure over the past 2 decades, it's like an economic steroid for growth. But Reeves is making this push when consumer prices in the UK are already sky high, and, get this, the Office for Budget Responsibility itself is warning that this borrowing spree will heat up inflation even further. Inflation isn't just a pesky word to throw around. It's the very core of government mismanagement, weighing down on businesses, households, and let's not forget, the very same labor groups they boast about helping. According to the OBR, inflation could be pushed 0.4 percentage points higher at its peak effect in 2025 to 2026 thanks to the elevated borrowing. In practical terms, this means that the more Reeves spends, the harder it will be to bring inflation down to the BOE's target of 2%, causing immense pressure on monetary policies. What Reeves wants to bulldoze into existence is frankly unattainable without ramifications. Her priority, to stimulate demand without providing adequate economic buffers, could lead to catastrophic inflation spikes. Even more, economists keep raising the alarm that government spending now will only tighten the screws on consumers further down the line. The aggressive rise in wages mixed with borrowing leads one place: higher prices everywhere. Businesses become like vultures, pushing their higher cost burdens onto consumers, feeding into a vicious inflation loop. In theory, the Bank of England should be able to alleviate pressure by simply cutting interest rates. That's what banks are supposed to do when the economy slows down, right? But real life is never that simple. Banks have one job: control inflation. Even though there has been one rate cut in August, the BOE finds itself stuck between the need to stimulate growth and its fear of more inflation as the economy gets pinched by increased borrowing costs and now potentially higher wages. Let us connect the dots visually here too: when governments spend more, because of more borrowing, inflation rises. The BOE then increases interest rates to choke off runaway inflation. Now, according to former rate-setting expert Deanne Julius, this budget has massive financial loosening implications. It's like giving the economy a ton of caffeine while expecting it to sleep peacefully. Once you ramp up spending and inflate wages dramatically, you are, fundamentally, making it tougher and tougher to sustain a long-term strategy for drawing back inflation without dramatic rate cuts from the BOE. The problem? The bank can't do much as long as higher inflationary risks remain in the air. The takeaway, folks. A clear inability of the government to steer consistently with monetary policy forces the BOE to remain paralyzed with rate cuts. If inflation's up, they'll have to proceed slower than their American cousins at the Federal Reserve or the ECB, and inflation expectations for 2025 remain way past their earlier projections at 2.6%, with most forecasting models already seeing an overshoot. Here comes the plot twist: the government's grand gesture to lift the national living wage by a whopping 6.7% to reach £12.21 per hour by 2025. Yes, real wages have been squeezed brutally by the ongoing cost of living crisis. We all felt that when energy bills doubled, but artificially hiking wages, particularly during an inflation crisis, often brings more smoke than fire. A wage hike above inflation is like pouring kerosene on a fire that already eats away at businesses. I hope none of you assume businesses will eat those costs. Who suffers first? Well, it's your local bakery, your high street shops, and service-based industries. According to Kate Shoesmith from the Recruitment and Employment Confederation, many businesses feel like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Forced to increase wages but unable to pass all the costs onto consumers without angering them, they're considering scaling back hours or freezing hiring altogether. It's a cruel system for the small and medium-sized firms that carry the economy on their back. When labor costs spiral, so do the price tags on your bread, on your haircuts, or even on your monthly gym membership. That only solidifies sticky inflation. We've got to ask, who's really benefiting here when this short-term gain could cause massive long-term distortions in the job market, let alone heating consumer prices way beyond the current inflation target? Markets absolutely do not work in isolation. The knock-on effect could hit harder in 2025 and beyond, as businesses become cautious with expanding or hiring new talent, which leads to historically low labor market participation rates over the long haul. So, are we helping the economy or just kicking the can down another hazardous road? Internationally, the BOE is facing fierce monetary competition. Over in the United States, the Federal Reserve has been far more proactive in instituting a succession of rate cuts, leaving the UK trailing. The Americans were quick to slow inflation with ample balance sheet surgeries at home. The Federal Reserve is expecting around 115 basis point cuts within the next year, and the European Central Bank is pushing for even more, targeting around 119 points of adjustment over the same 12-month window. Meanwhile, the UK Central Bank, inherently slow out of the gate, is likely to cut less than 100 basis points in the same stretch following sluggish decisions forced by government intervention. Dragged down kicking and screaming, the BOE's conservative pace could leave UK businesses further disadvantaged globally while inflation runs riot domestically. Traders, watching these developments closely, have significantly dialed back any immediate optimism for an aggressive rate cut in December. I'll put it simply, you don't want to be playing catch-up when your main trading competitors, such as Germany, France, and the United States, are getting cheaper credit and cheaper borrowing costs, while the UK's decision-makers are dragging their feet, choking on their own dithering budget contradictions. Thank you for sticking through the chaos. Those on Threadneedle Street, the BOE's base of operations, are stuck in an economic malaise orchestrated by political leaders unwilling to confront the difficult truth. You cannot solve systemic inflation problems by dumping more money into the economy without long-term repercussions. We're far, far beyond economic models here. The budgeting genius of boosting GDP through borrowed spending while passing higher wages onto businesses has the odd effect of overheating retail prices, hiring freezes, restless capital markets, and, worst of all, more suffering for average consumers who'll see no real wage gain, only higher inflation eroding their purchasing power. Transfers, in this case, may be popular, but they throw fire onto the very inflationary inferno the Bank of England desperately needs to quell. The labor market shrinks while real buying power diminishes, leaving the UK set for a grim reality in the near future. Ladies and gentlemen, there's no easy way out of this mess, but one thing is clear: unless a dramatic overhaul of economic fundamentals takes place, we're looking at years of further stagnation, increased costs, and a government increasingly detached from the ground realities the average consumer faces day to day. In conclusion, the Bank of England may be forced to ride this storm out far longer than they initially planned, continuously watching their rate policies dashed against political ignorance and economic self-destruction. Keep your eyes on November 7th when the BOE rolls out their new forecasts, and expect them to brace for long-term pain because that seems to be all will get delivered under this government's fiscal pipe dream.